All the suitors were rejected, until the alien princess chose the silent one. The hall was already shaking with noise when I walked in, and I was nobody. That is the honest truth. I was carrying a leather satchel full of diplomatic documents, wearing a plain gray suit that was slightly too big in the shoulders, and my job for the next 3 days was to stand near the back wall, stay quiet and hand papers to Ambassador Holt whenever he needed them. I was not a suitor. I was not a delegate. I was an aide, a background detail, the kind of person who exists in important rooms so that important people do not have to carry their own bags. The sovereign court of Velthara did not care about people like me, and I was perfectly comfortable with that arrangement. But I want to tell you, the moment I stepped through those doors, every thought I had about staying invisible was immediately tested, not because someone noticed me, because the room itself demanded to be noticed. The palace was built inside a carved mountain on the moon of Ethon 7, a pale, fog-covered world that orbited a gas giant so enormous it filled half the sky outside every window. The court hall was a perfect oval, its walls made of something between stone and glass that seemed to breathe with the light pale blue one moment, soft silver the next. The ceiling was open to a dome of reinforced crystal, and through it you could see the swirling orange and red storms of the giant planet above, churning slowly like a painting that never finished drying. There were delegates from 14 species standing in that room. 14. I had studied the briefing files on the transport ship. I knew the names. The Velkin delegation stood near the eastern arch, tall, blue-gray, with smooth heads and vocal cords that could produce harmonics no human ear was built to fully process. Their lead suitor was a warlord named Drevaxal, and he wore ceremonial armor that had been carved, according to the notes, from the bones of a creature he had personally hunted on a dying world. He stood perfectly still, and radiated the particular kind of confidence that comes from never having been told no. Beside them were the Korathi. I had to work not to stare. The Korathi prince, whose name in translation came out roughly as "he who moves between stars," had skin that shifted color the way the surface of deep water shifts in changing light, gold to violet to a deep, warm green. He was watching the room with large, calm eyes, and every few minutes his skin would pulse with something that the briefing file described as an involuntary emotional broadcast. He was excited. He was certain he would be chosen. The Myron scholar in the far corner was speaking quietly to a floating translation device in what I counted as at least 4 different languages in under 2 minutes. He was ancient by his species standards, which meant his mind was reportedly a living archive of 300 years of knowledge. He had reportedly memorized every text the Velthara Royal Library contained before the rite even began. And then there was our group, the human delegation. Ambassador Holt was a good man, steady, experienced, and deeply aware that humanity was the newest and least decorated species in this gathering. He had a prepared speech. He had practiced it for 6 weeks on the ship. He had good posture and a firm handshake and a sincere desire to represent Earth with dignity. And standing next to the warlord with the bone armor, he looked like a geography teacher at a convention for professional athletes. I stood behind him and slightly to the left, holding the satchel, and I tried to be part of the wall. The ceremony had a structure. Each delegation would be formally announced. Each suitor would step forward. Each suitor would offer a greeting and a gift to the princess before she descended to the main floor for the resonance rite. The princess would not appear until every suitor had been presented. That was the rule. That was the tradition. The court had been holding this rite for 600 years. What nobody in the briefing files had adequately prepared me for was the sound. When the Velkin warlord stepped forward and opened his throat to deliver his greeting, it was not a sound that traveled through air the way human voices do. It was a vibration. It moved through the floor, through my shoes, up through my legs and into my chest, and it carried something that was almost like emotion but was coming from outside my body rather than inside. The court responded with a long, low hum of approval. Even the Korathi prince's skin shifted to a warm amber. Drevexal offered his gift, a map of 47 contested star systems, all of which he had, apparently, already claimed and was now choosing to offer as tribute. 47 star systems, in a box, as a gift. Ambassador Holt, standing 3 feet from me, quietly exhaled. I did not envy him. But then the Velkin sat down and the Korathi prince rose and the room changed again. He did not speak at first. He simply stood in the center of the floor and let his skin do the talking. It moved through colors so slowly and so beautifully that half the room leaned forward without realizing it. When he did speak, his voice carried the musical quality of his species, every sentence landing like a note held just long enough to mean something. His gift was a song, not a recorded song. He composed it in the room, in real time, dedicated entirely to the honor of meeting the princess he had not yet seen. It lasted 4 minutes, and when it ended, a Myron official in the gallery actually pressed a hand to her chest. By the time Ambassador Holt gave his speech, we had sat through 11 presentations. The speech was good. It was warm and honest and human, and it landed in that room with roughly the same impact as a politely placed stone. Polite applause. A few curious glances at the human delegation. One of the Korathi observers tilted their head with what I had learned from the file was a gesture of mild confusion. I refilled the water glasses on the side table near our section. It was something to do. Then a sound moved through the room, not loud, not announced, but felt. The court went completely still, and she walked in. I want to be careful about how I describe this because I am aware of how it sounds, and I am also aware that I was just the aide standing by the wall. But the truth is that the moment Princess Lyrakel entered the hall, the 14 species in that room responded in 14 different ways, and every single one of those ways was the same way. They stopped. Everything they had been doing, the whispering, the posturing, the quiet calculations, it all paused. She was tall, though not the tallest in the room. The Velthara were humanoid in most ways that mattered, with pale silver skin and white hair that moved slightly in ways that had nothing to do with air currents. Her eyes were the color of old ice, not cold but deep, the way ice looks when it has been there long enough to have a memory. She wore nothing ceremonial. No armor, no display, no gift-bearing attendants around her. She wore a long gray garment that made her look less like a princess and more like someone who had decided, long ago, that the performance was beneath her. What I noticed, and I noticed it before I noticed anything else, was that she was tired. Not sleepy. Tired in the way that someone gets tired when they have been required to be extraordinary every single day for years and years and years, and they are very good at hiding it, but they cannot hide it from everyone forever. She stood at the center of the floor and looked at the 14 suitor delegations arranged before her, and for just a moment, less than a second, her expression was the expression of someone standing in front of a meal they already know they will not enjoy. Then the mask went back up, composed, gracious, present. She greeted each delegation. She acknowledged each gift. She said the correct things in the correct order with the skill of someone who had been trained since childhood to make obligations feel like choices. And then she did something that nobody in the briefing file had mentioned. She glanced toward the window. Just once, just for a moment, looking out at the giant planet turning slowly in the sky above, not like someone admiring a view, like someone checking whether the exit was still there. Nobody else seemed to notice. The court was too busy watching her face, her hands, her posture. The suitors were mentally rehearsing their next steps. I noticed it because I was not trying to impress her. I was just watching a person. The first round of rejections came before the evening ended. 15 suitors from 6 delegations were dismissed with the kind of precise, graceful politeness that made the rejection feel almost like a gift. Which somehow made it worse. The court rippled with shock and whispers. The dismissed suitors were escorted out with full ceremony, but the message was very clear. Drevexal was not among the dismissed, neither was the Korathi prince, neither was the Myron scholar. Ambassador Holt, having survived round one, leaned over to me as the hall began to clear and said quietly, "I have absolutely no idea what she is looking for." I watched her one more time as she was escorted from the floor by her attendants. She paused at the door. She looked again at the window, at the storm above. I did not know what she was looking for either. But I thought, in a way I could not explain and did not try to, that it was something this room did not currently contain. I picked up the satchel. I helped fold the flag stand. I carried the empty water glasses back to the service corridor. Nobody watched me leave. That was fine. That was exactly how it was supposed to be. I stopped trying to track the days after the third one, because the days had started to blur together in the way that happens when every day contains the same ingredients arranged in a slightly different order. Morning briefings with Ambassador Holt, where I took notes and said very little. Long afternoon sessions in the court where another round of suitors presented something extraordinary and left looking quietly devastated. Evening walks through whichever corridor of the palace happened to be near me when my legs needed movement. The palace was enormous. That helped. You could walk for an hour and not retrace a step, and in a building full of delegations from 14 species all navigating their own politics and anxieties, it was surprisingly easy to find a corner where nobody was performing anything for anyone. I found the library on the second night. It was not the Grand Library. That one was in the East Wing and was technically restricted to senior delegates and the princess's scholars. This was something smaller, tucked at the end of a corridor that seemed to exist mostly for the convenience of the palace staff. The shelves were old and the books on them were physical, which surprised me. Paper or something close to paper, not data slates, not projection archives. Actual bound volumes with spines and pages, and the particular smell that old books have, which is one of those smells that seems to cross species lines, because even in an alien palace on a moon orbiting a gas giant, it smelled like every library I had ever been in. I picked one at random and sat down on the bench near the narrow window. The storm planet glowed outside. I read. I was 3 chapters in when I heard the door open. I did not look up immediately, because it had not occurred to me that it would be anyone relevant to look up for. That was my default setting in this palace. Assume that whoever was entering a room was not entering it for me. So I was still reading when someone stopped directly beside my bench, and I looked up. The princess was standing in the middle of the library in a plain gray robe, no attendants, holding a small lamp of her own because the library lights were dim at this hour. Her white hair was loose. Her silver eyes were looking at the book in my hands with an expression that was half curiosity and half something more careful. My brain did several things at once. The first was to recognize her. The second was to begin the process of standing up and offering a formal acknowledgement. The third, and this happened faster than the second, was the quiet observation that she looked completely different without the court watching her. Not smaller, not less, just more like a person. She said, in the common trade language we had both been briefed in, "What is that?" I held up the cover. A novel from Earth. I brought a few on the transport. This one is about ordinary people doing ordinary things. She looked at the cover, she looked at me. Why would someone write about that? I find it restful, I said. Everything else here is very large. She was quiet for a moment. Then she sat down at the other end of the bench. Not close, not formal, just somewhere to sit. I did not make a production of it. I did not stand up straighter or lower my eyes or say something meaningful about the honor of her presence. She had just sat down. People sat down. I shifted slightly toward my end of the bench to give her more room, and I went back to reading. The silence lasted maybe 10 minutes. Then she said, "The Korathi prince composed another dedication this afternoon. For me, it was 22 minutes long." I turned a page, Was it good? It was extraordinary, she said, and the word carried more exhaustion than I had expected. Everything here is extraordinary, every single day, every single person. They are all extraordinary all the time without pausing. I thought about that. I said, that sounds tiring. She turned her head and looked at me. I could feel it without looking up. Yes, she said, it does. I read another paragraph. She sat with her lamp and did not leave. It was, I realized later, the longest she had stayed in any room during the rite without someone performing something at her. After that evening, I saw her in places I had not expected to see a princess. The East Garden at sunrise, sitting on a stone wall with both feet hanging over the edge like a child, watching the fog burn off the mountain. The service corridor near the kitchen, standing very still beside a window with a cup of something warm wrapped in both hands. The small courtyard behind the West Hall where the decorative fish moved in slow circles in a stone pool. I was in all of those places too, because I moved through the palace the way water moves, finding the quiet routes, avoiding the main corridors where delegations were always in motion and always in costume. It did not occur to me that she might be doing the same thing. Each time I did not make it strange. I nodded, she nodded. If there was something to say, we said it. If there was not, we did not invent something. The second real conversation happened in the East Garden. She was already there when I arrived, and I sat down on the lower wall because my feet hurt and the view was good, and after a while she said, without preamble, "You have not presented yourself as a suitor." "No," I said, "I am not a suitor. I carry things for Ambassador Holt." "I know what you do," she said. "I meant that you have not tried." I looked at her. I had not been prepared for that particular sentence, and I was not entirely sure I was reading it correctly. I said, "That is not what I am here for." "No," she agreed, "that is what I mean." She was quiet for a moment. The fog moved below us. The planet above had a storm system the size of a continent churning in its upper atmosphere, visible even in daylight as a dark spiral. She said, "Have you eaten this morning?" I blinked. I was going to after this. "There is bread from the northern kitchen," she said. "It is better than what they serve in the delegation hall. The cooks make it before dawn." She paused. "I will tell one of the staff." She stood up, and before she left she stopped and said, with something that was almost not quite, but almost amusement, "The Velkin warlord gave me a star system this morning." I said, "Was it a nice one?" She looked at me for a moment, then she left. The bread arrived at my door 20 minutes later. It was good bread, dense and warm and nothing like the food back home, but good. I sat on the floor of my small room, eating bread and reading my book, and I did not think about the princess at all, because it did not occur to me that there was anything to think about. 3 days later, she wore a different kind of robe to the morning court session. Not ceremonial, something plainer, something closer to what she wore in the garden. The senior court official noticed and said something to one of the attendants in a language I did not catch. The Korathi prince, watching from his delegation section, shifted to a color I had not seen him use before. The briefing file described it as deep gold and noted that in Korathi body language, it indicated recognition of something unexpected. I was by the wall. I was holding the satchel. Ambassador Holt leaned over and whispered, "Have you done something I should know about?" I said I gave her a recommendation on bread. He stared at me. I kept my eyes forward. That afternoon, during the third formal round of the rite, 3 more suitors were dismissed. The Myron scholar's 300-language presentation was declared magnificent, and he was told, with exquisite gentleness, that his mind was one of the great treasures of the galaxy, and that she hoped his next journey brought him exactly what he was searching for. He was not what she was searching for. Drevexal remained. The Korathi prince remained. 4 others whose presentations had landed close enough to something real that the court had not yet let them go. I watched her during the dismissals. She was kind. She was sincere. She said the right things and meant at least some of them. But when the last dismissed suitor bowed and turned away, she looked, just for a breath, toward the corner of the room where I was standing. Not at me. At least I told myself not at me, just toward that side of the room. I looked down at the satchel strap. I adjusted it. I told myself it meant nothing, because believing otherwise felt like the beginning of a mistake I was not equipped to make. I was the aide, she was the princess. The planet turned above the dome. The light shifted from silver to gray. The rite was not finished. And I was not paying attention to the right things. The crisis arrived on a Tuesday, which was a human way of tracking time that meant nothing to anyone else in the palace, but gave me a thread to hold on to. It started as a sound, not the layered ceremonial sounds the court was filled with daily, but a sharper sound. Raised voices from the direction of the East Treaty Hall, where the secondary delegations held their side meetings. I was crossing the main corridor with a stack of amended scheduled documents when I heard it, and I stopped, because in 2 weeks of moving through this palace, I had not heard that sound once. The Velthara court was a place of enormous formality. Everything here had a structure. Even disagreements were structured. This was not structured. By the time I reached the doorway of the East Hall, the situation had already become something that had a name. Ambassador Holt was there, as were 3 other senior delegates, and the room was split sharply down the middle between the Velkin delegation on one side and a species I had largely noted only in passing, the Garath, a gray-skinned, 4-armed people from a system near the edge of the contested boundary zones. Their lead delegate had both sets of arms crossed, which according to my reading was a serious posture in their culture. The Velkin representative in the room was not Drevaxal but his chief advisor, and the advisor's voice was doing that frequency thing that bypassed air and went straight into your chest. Nobody was threatening anyone, not technically, but the room felt like a stretched wire. I found a wall and stood against it and listened. The argument was about a border, specifically about whether a star system called Velkith 9 fell within the territory acknowledged in the Third Expansion Agreement, a treaty signed 14 years ago between the Velkin and Garath governments. The Garath were claiming it as unclaimed neutral space. The Velkin were calling it part of the acknowledged expansion boundary. Both sides had brought documents. Both sides were absolutely certain. Both sides were also, it appeared, citing slightly different texts. I stayed quiet and listened, because nobody was asking me anything and that was normal. But something was bothering me. I had heard those treaty numbers before. I had spent 3 evenings in the small library reading. Not all of my reading had been the novel from Earth. I had also, partly from boredom, partly from the particular habit I had of reading whatever was nearby, worked through several of the older bound volumes on the lower shelves, including one that turned out to be a historical summary of the 3rd and 4th boundary agreements between the species who had originally contested this moon's surrounding systems. The 3rd Expansion Agreement, as I had read it, had 2 versions. That was the thing that was bothering me. I did not interrupt the argument. I went back to my room, found the notes I had taken in the small notebook I carried everywhere, the kind of notebook you use when you don't trust electronic records in unfamiliar buildings, and I read them again. Then I went to the small library, because the bound copy I had read was still there, and I confirmed what I had read. The agreement had an original text and a revised clarification issued 11 months later. The revision changed 3 boundary descriptions. Velkith 9 appeared in all 3. The Velkin were citing the original. The Garath were citing the revision. Neither side appeared to know the other version existed. I went back to my room. I sat down at the small writing desk and wrote it out 1 page, clear and short, what the discrepancy was, which text each side was using, what the revision said, where the copy of the revision could be found. I did not offer an opinion on who was right. I did not recommend a course of action. I just wrote down what the document said and where they were. I folded the page. I found Ambassador Holt in the corridor outside the East Hall, where he had stepped out looking like a man who had developed a headache behind both eyes simultaneously. I handed him the page and said, "This might be relevant." He read it again, he looked at me, he said, "Where did you find this?" "The small library on the west corridor, third shelf from the floor." He looked at the page again. "You read the old boundary records." "I was bored," I said honestly. He stared at me for another moment, and then turned and went back into the East Hall. I went to find something to eat. The argument in the East Hall ended within 2 hours. I did not go back. There was no reason for me to go back. By early evening, the official announcement from the court administration was that a documentation discrepancy had been identified and resolved, that both delegations had agreed to the revised boundary interpretation, and that the right of residence would continue as scheduled the following morning. No names mentioned, no individual credited. The official statement said the resolution had come through the combined efforts of the senior diplomatic staff. I heard this from Ambassador Holt, who found me at dinner and sat down across from me and said, "You know your name is not in the report." "I know," I said. "I could add it." "Please don't." He looked at me for a long time. He was a good man. He had good instincts, and he had been in enough rooms to know when something was happening that he did not entirely understand. He said, "Are you sure you're just an aide, Caleb?" My name is Caleb North, by the way. I have been describing myself as nobody for 2 pages, and I should probably correct that. Caleb North, junior diplomatic aide, third of 4 on Ambassador Holt's team, age 29, originally from a small city in England that nobody ever recognized the name of, currently eating soup in an alien palace on a moon orbiting a gas giant, and trying very hard to believe that his life was still ordinary. I said, "I'm sure." Holt nodded once, took the page and left. I finished my soup. What I did not know, and would not know for a long time, was that the princess had been standing in the gallery above the East Hall when the argument was happening. She had been there for the beginning and the middle and the end, watching through the carved stone lattice that ran along the upper level where royalty could observe without being seen. She had watched the shouting. She had watched the tension. She had watched 2 powerful delegations nearly turn a courtship ceremony into a diplomatic fracture. And she had watched me walk in, stand against the wall, listen, and then walk out. She had not seen the note, but she had seen the moment 3 hours later when Ambassador Holt walked back into the hall and said something quietly to the lead mediator, who then called both delegations back to the table with a piece of paper in his hand. She had seen the room change. She had looked from the gallery toward the door I had walked out of. I learned all of this much later, from her. She told it to me on a night when we were both sitting in the East Garden long after the palace had gone quiet, and she was trying to explain in her precise and careful way the thing that had shifted for her in that week. She said, "You walked out of that room and you did not look back to see what happened. You did not wait for anyone to notice." I told her I had gone to find soup. She said, "I know. The kitchen staff told me. And that is the part I keep returning to. The hall is falling apart. 14 delegations are holding their breath, and you fixed it and then went to eat soup." I told her it was good soup. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something I have thought about many times since. She said, "I have known leaders who started wars to avoid admitting they made an error. I have sat across the table from people who would have demanded a parade for what you did. And you went and ate soup. I did not know it was possible to be that way. But I am ahead of myself. That conversation came later. What happened in the days after the crisis was this. The rite resumed. The remaining suitors returned to their presentations and their performances and their gifts. The Korathi prince composed another song. Drevaxal made another offer. 2 suitors who had been holding on through the earlier rounds were dismissed with the same gracious finality that had become the rhythm of the rite. And every time I came around a corner and the princess was somewhere nearby, the moment lasted a little longer before one of us moved on. She stopped me in the corridor outside the delegation hall on the fourth day after the crisis. No one else around. She said simply, "The soup, was it better than the bread?" I considered it. Different. The bread was better for early mornings. The soup was better when the day had been long. She nodded slowly, as if this was information she was filing away. She said, "I have never chosen what I eat. The kitchen schedules meals based on the diplomatic calendar and the needs of the court. I have eaten what has been prepared for me every day of my life." I did not know what to say to that, so I said, "Is there something you would choose if you could?" She thought about it for a long time, long enough that I wondered if the question had been wrong. Then she said, "Something ordinary, something with no ceremony attached to it." I nodded. I said, "I will see what I can find." The next morning, I talked to one of the younger kitchen staff, a Velthara woman who had been cautiously friendly to our delegation since the first day, and I asked her if it was possible to set aside a small plate of plain bread and a bowl of the early fruit that grew on the south side of the moon, which I had seen in the market area and which smelled extraordinary, and leave it outside the small library on the west corridor at sunrise, without any ceremony or announcement. She looked at me for a long moment. Then she said, in careful common language, "You understand that nobody has ever asked for something like that." "I know," I said. "Is it possible?" She said it was possible. I did not go to the library at sunrise. It was not for me. I went to the morning briefing with Holt and took my notes and held the satchel and stood by the wall. Later that day, in the afternoon break between sessions, I passed the princess in the main corridor for the first time with her full attendant escort surrounding her. She was in full formal presentation, head up, silver eyes forward, every inch the image the court required. She did not look at me. But as she passed, she said, very quietly without turning her head, one word in common language. "Good." Her attendants did not react. They had not heard it or had chosen not to. The delegation officials nearby were looking at their schedules. I kept walking. I did not smile until I had turned the corner. That evening, 2 more suitors were dismissed. Drevak Sal, the Velkin warlord with 47 star systems in a box, was among them. The court nearly stopped breathing. He accepted it with a stillness that was either great dignity or great rage, and the briefing file later suggested it was probably both. The Korathi prince remained, 3 others remained, and the rite moved toward its final ceremony. Ambassador Holt, reviewing the updated suitor list that evening, tapped the page and said, mostly to himself, "She still hasn't found what she's looking for." I was writing up the day's notes. I did not look up. I still did not think it was me. The final ceremony of the rite of resonance was set for the last evening of the gathering, when the great planet above Ethon 7 would be at its closest orbital point, and the dome of the court hall would fill with the reddish gold light that only came once every 14 months. The court considered it a sacred window. The light meant something in the old traditions that the briefing file explained in 2 paragraphs, and that I probably did not fully understand. What I understood was that the hall that evening was the most extraordinary version of an already extraordinary place. The light poured through the dome in long amber columns. Every delegation had dressed for ceremony. The Korathi prince's skin was cycling through colors so slowly and so deliberately that it seemed like he was composing something visual, the way a musician composes sound. The remaining suitors stood in a line of extraordinary beings, each one representing the absolute best their civilization could send. I was by the door. I was holding a diplomatic scroll that Ambassador Holt might need if a specific procedural question arose during the ceremony. It was the kind of task that exists to give someone somewhere to stand. The court official announced the beginning of the final rite. The remaining suitors were asked to step forward to the center floor. They did. All four of them, standing in that amber light, representing power and beauty and ancient tradition, and the kind of presence that fills a room without effort. The court official then announced the resonance word. In the Velthara tradition, the resonance word was not a question. It was a declaration. The princess would speak aloud, in the common language so all delegations could understand, the quality or truth she had discovered during the weeks of the rite that she required in a partner. The suitors would then have one opportunity to respond. The choosing would follow. The hall went absolutely quiet. The light moved. The princess walked to the center of the floor. She stood still for a moment, not performing stillness, actually still, in the way I had noticed in the garden and the library and the early morning corridor. The court was watching her with 14 species worth of anticipation, and she was looking at the floor just ahead of her feet, gathering something. Then she raised her head, and in a clear, even voice she spoke the resonance word. It came first in her own language, a long, soft phrase that the translator rendered in common tongue as, "I seek the one who was present when they had no reason to be." The hall held its silence for a breath. Then the four suitors on the floor began to speak. Of course they did. They were suitors. They had answers. The Korathi prince stepped forward with that warm amber color rising in his skin, and he began to speak about presence, about how his entire life had been a form of showing up, of being visible, of making himself known in every room he entered. The second suitor spoke about dedication, about the 17 years he had spent preparing for this rite, about the ways he had arranged his entire existence around the possibility of being here. The third spoke about loyalty, about the treaties he had held, the commitments he had never broken, the presence he maintained in governance and alliance. They were not wrong answers. They were true answers. They were good answers. The princess raised her hand. They stopped. She had not been looking at them while they spoke. I noticed it the way I always notice things about her by then, not by trying to, but simply because paying attention to her had become the thing my eyes did when she was in the room. She had been looking past the suitor line, toward the wider floor, and then toward the walls, and then, slowly, with the kind of movement that does not announce itself, toward the door. Toward my corner. She was looking at me. I was aware, suddenly and completely, of about 14 things at once. The weight of the scroll in my hands, the two big shoulders of my gray suit, the fact that I was not on the floor, not in the suitor line, not part of this ceremony in any formal capacity whatsoever. The fact that every delegation in the room was now, following the direction of her gaze, also looking toward the door. Ambassador Holt, standing 6 feet to my left, turned his head and looked at me with an expression that I can only describe as a man discovering that the geography teacher had, in fact, been a professional athlete the entire time. The princess walked across the floor. She walked the full length of the central court, past the suitor line, past the delegation sections, past the senior officials and the court administrators and the representatives of 14 species, and she stopped in front of me. Up close in that amber light, her silver eyes were very clear. She was not performing anything. She was just looking at me the way people look at each other when they are deciding to say something true. She said quietly, just for me, though the silence of the hall meant that quietly carried, "Did you know?" I looked at her. I thought about the library and the garden and the bread and the note I had handed Holt without waiting to see what happened. I thought about every moment I had spent in this palace being exactly what I was: nobody important, nobody trying. A man with a satchel and a paperback novel, and a habit of noticing when someone hadn't eaten. I said, "No, I just thought you seemed like you could use someone who wasn't trying so hard." Something changed in her face, not dramatically, not like a door swinging open, more like a window just slightly letting in new air. She laughed. It was a real laugh, not a court laugh, not a gracious acknowledgement of something amusing. A real one surprised out of her, genuine in the way that real things are when they are not planned. I learned later, from one of the senior attendants who had served in the court for 20 years, that the princess had not laughed like that in the court hall in 7 years. The hall held its silence for another full second after that laugh, and then it absolutely did not hold its silence anymore. Every delegation erupted at once. 14 species have 14 different ways of expressing shock, outrage, confusion, and disbelief, and in that moment I heard all of them simultaneously. The Velkin advisor's voice went into a frequency that I felt in my back teeth. The Korathi prince's skin cycled through colors I had not seen catalogued in the briefing file. 2 court officials were speaking directly into communication devices. Ambassador Holt had the expression of a man who had just been handed a responsibility he had not applied for. The princess did not turn around. She was still looking at me. She held out her hand, her palm upward, her fingers slightly open, a gesture that I knew from the files was not a romantic gesture in her culture. It was the gesture of choosing, of extending something that required a response, of offering without demanding. I looked at her hand, I looked at her face. I was a nobody from a city nobody recognized, holding a diplomatic scroll, wearing a suit that was too big in the shoulders. I had no star systems to give her. I could not shift the color of my skin or produce harmonics in 17 frequencies. I could not compose a song in the room or offer 47 claimed worlds as a gift. What I had was a paperback novel, a good habit of listening, and the apparently extraordinary ability to just be in a room without making it about me. I shifted the scroll to my left hand. I put my right hand in hers. The hall did not quiet down for a long time after that. Let me be honest, it did not fully quiet down for about 6 months. There were formal protests from 3 delegations, 2 of which were eventually withdrawn, and 1 of which turned into a lengthy legal process that I am told was eventually resolved, though I was not involved in resolving it. The Korathi prince left the following morning. His farewell was composed and gracious, and his skin stayed a cool, steady blue the entire time, which the file noted indicated dignified acceptance, and I respected him for it enormously. Ambassador Holt called home that evening and gave a report that I would very much like to have heard, because his face during the call had a particular quality that I can only describe as a man carefully choosing every single word. The court spent 3 days in various forms of formal procedure determining whether what had happened was valid within the tradition of the right. It was determined, after much deliberation, that the tradition had never specifically excluded a non-suitor from the choosing. It had simply never occurred before. This was noted as precedent, filed appropriately, and I was told that the precedent document now exists in the Grand Library, which is both flattering and extremely strange to think about. Through all of it, Lyracle was steady. She did not flinch from the protests or the procedures. She answered every formal challenge with the kind of precision that reminded everyone who she was, not just the woman who had made an unexpected choice, but the sovereign who had been prepared from birth to defend every decision she made in that court. She was, I realized during those 3 days, not the tired figure I had first seen by the window at all. She was someone who had been tired of performing. The moment she stopped, she became something else entirely, steady and clear and absolutely certain. She was, it turned out, the most capable person in any room she entered. She simply chose, for once, not to spend that capacity impressing anyone. On the 4th morning after the ceremony, she found me in the East Garden before the official schedule began. I was on the lower wall with my feet hanging over the edge, looking at the fog. She sat down beside me, not at the other end this time. Beside me, close enough that I was aware of her in a way that felt different from every other morning. She said, "They are going to make this difficult." I said, "Probably." She said, "The Velkin delegation has submitted a formal complaint to the Interspecies Council. The Garath want a review of the entire right proceedings. There are 3 senior court officials who have requested an audience with me to express concern about the stability of the political relationships this choice may affect. I looked at the fog. I said, "What are you going to tell them?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "The truth, that the right is sovereign, that the choosing is mine, that I exercised my right under 600 years of tradition, and that the tradition is intact." I nodded. "That seems right." She looked at me. "Are you not worried?" I thought about it honestly. I'm a little worried about the suit. I only brought 2 and one has a stain from the soup. She looked at me for a long moment. And then she laughed again, that same real, unplanned laugh that had shaken the court hall, and this time there was no hall full of dignitaries to hear it. It was just the garden and the fog and the planet above turning in the early light. I thought in that moment that I understood something I had not understood before. Not about her. Not about the politics. About the things she had said in the corridor. About never choosing what she ate. About never having anything ordinary. She had been surrounded by extraordinary things her entire life, and had been slowly starved of the plain, undecorated reality of simply being a person in a room. I was the most ordinary thing she had ever been offered. And ordinary to her was the rarest thing in the galaxy. I reached into my jacket pocket and produced the second and final food item I had asked the kitchen staff to prepare in advance. It was bread again, the good kind, from the northern kitchen. I had asked for 2 pieces this time. I held one out to her without a word. She took it, she looked at it, she looked at me. She said, "You planned this." "I planned the bread," I said. "The rest I had no idea about." She took a bite of the bread. I took a bite of mine. The fog moved below us. The giant planet turned. The day had not yet formally begun. We sat there, 2 people eating bread on a wall, and for the first time since I had arrived on that moon, I felt like the room I was in was exactly the right size. I am writing this from a chair by a window in a room I know very well now, on the evening of what would be, in Earth terms, the 5th anniversary of the day I handed a piece of bread to a princess in a garden on a moon I had never expected to see. The planet is outside the window, the way it always is. The storm system that has been moving across its surface since before I arrived is still there, which I find deeply reassuring. Some things are slow enough to feel permanent. A lot has changed. Let me tell you about the parts worth knowing. The political difficulty did not last as long as people expected it to. This is the thing about interstellar politics that I have learned in 5 years of living inside it. It makes an enormous amount of noise, and then, eventually, it follows the facts. The facts were that the rite had been conducted according to tradition, that the choice was valid, and that the Princess of Velthara had made it clearly and without hesitation, and had not reversed it under any amount of pressure. When the facts are that solid, the noise has nowhere to go. The Velkin complaint was reviewed and closed. The Garath proceedings were resolved through a separate mediation that, I am told, was actually strengthened by the reminder that documentation discrepancies needed to be taken seriously. I did not participate in that mediation officially, but I sent a note. Drevak Sal, the warlord with the star systems, sent a formal acknowledgement 3 months after the rite. It was not warm exactly, but it was respectful. He noted that the choosing had been sovereign and that the Velkin would honor the tradition. He also included at the end of the letter a single line that I have thought about a great deal. It said, "I did not understand the choosing. I hope in time I will." I thought that was a remarkable thing to admit. I told Lyrakel, and she said it was more remarkable than most people would ever know, given who he was. The Korathi prince sent a gift 6 months later, a recording of the song he had composed in the court hall, the one that had made the Myron official press her hand to her chest. He had titled it, in the accompanying note, "For What I Did Not Know I Was Searching For." I have listened to it many times. It is extraordinary. Everything about the Korathi is extraordinary. I find it easier to appreciate now that I am not standing next to it feeling inadequate. Ambassador Holt was promoted. which he deserved entirely, and which had nothing to do with me except that his report of the proceedings apparently contained what his superiors described as an unusually complete account of human presence during a critical diplomatic moment. He called me once on a relay line and said, "I still tell people the bread story, Caleb. I hope you know that." I told him I was glad the bread was worth telling about. Humanity, as a species, had a complicated few months following the news. Complicated in the way that things are complicated when they are unexpected, and people do not yet have a framework for thinking about them. Some people were proud in the loud, banner-waving sense. Some people were suspicious in the way that humans become suspicious when something good happens without an obvious explanation. Some people found the story funny, and some people found it moving, and some people found it both at the same time, which is the most honest response. What I noticed was that after a while, the framework people settled on was this, that it made a certain kind of sense. That if you were going to send humanity into a room full of extraordinary species, what humanity would do is exactly what had happened. Not win through power or beauty or ancient wisdom. Win by being the ones who noticed that someone hadn't eaten and did something about it. I do not know if that is entirely true of humanity. I know it is true of some of us. I think it is enough. Lyracle and I were formally joined in ceremony 1 year after the rite, in a smaller ceremony than the one that had been planned, smaller because we both agreed that large ceremonies were something to be used carefully and not often. There was bread at the gathering. I insisted. She thought this was funny and then agreed, and then, when the bread actually arrived in the middle of the formal proceedings, laughed in that real way that still, after everything, catches me slightly off guard in the best way. The joining was not without difficulty. I want to be honest about that. Two people from two different worlds, two different species, two different entire frameworks for understanding what life is and what it is for, that is not a thing that resolves itself simply because it begins well. There were months that required more patience than I had known I possessed. There were conversations that lasted until the planet outside the window had moved from one side of the sky to the other. There were moments when the distance between what we understood about each other was so wide it felt impossible. But here is what I learned in those moments. The distance was never permanent. It was always crossable, not because we were exceptional, although she is exceptional, genuinely, in ways I learn new things about regularly, but because we had both decided that the crossing was worth doing. Every time. She once asked me, during a particularly difficult stretch in the second year, whether I ever thought about going home. I said I thought about England sometimes. I told her what it looked like, the gray skis and the green fields and the particular light of an afternoon in October when the clouds move fast and the whole world looks like it is breathing. She listened to all of it, and then she said, "Tell me more about October." So I did. I talked about October for a long time, in more detail than I had ever talked about it before, because nobody had ever asked me to before. And when I finished, she was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I would like to see it." We went the following year. I took her to the city nobody recognized the name of, in October, on a gray and green afternoon. She wore a coat with a hood, and she walked on an ordinary street, and she bought bread from an ordinary bakery without ceremony, and she looked at the sky, which was doing the breathing thing I had described, and she said one word. "Yes." I asked her what she meant. She said, "I understand now why you were not overwhelmed by this palace. You already lived somewhere beautiful." I had never thought of it that way. I have thought about it many times since. There is something I want to say about humanity, now that I have spent 5 years as the only human in a position like mine. I have had time to think about it carefully, and I want to be careful now because I am aware of how these things can sound like a species boasting, like a story wrapping itself up too neatly. So let me say it as plainly as I can. We are not the strongest. We are not the oldest. We are not the most beautiful or the most scientifically advanced or the most ancient in our wisdom. In that court hall, filled with 14 species each extraordinary in their own way, We were probably the least impressive thing in the room by almost every measurable standard. But here is what I think is true about human beings, based on evidence. We notice when someone has not eaten. We sit down next to people without making it into a performance. We fix things and then go find soup. We carry books about ordinary people doing ordinary things into rooms full of extraordinary people, because we find it restful. We give jackets, we ask questions, we shift slightly to make room on a bench. These are small things. I know they are small things, but I have spent 5 years watching what happens when small things are offered consistently, without expectation, without performance, and without an audience, and what I have seen is this. They are not small to the person receiving them. To someone who has never been offered the small things, they are enormous. Lyracle told me once, this was in the 3rd year, on one of those long nights when we talk until the planet moves, that she had spent her entire life being offered greatness. Every suitor, every delegation, every official in every meeting had come to her carrying the largest thing they had, the greatest gift, the most impressive display, the highest possible offer. She said, "Nobody ever offered me their jacket before you. Nobody ever asked if I had eaten. Nobody ever shifted on a bench to give me space. Those things seem so small that I think people assumed they were beneath offering to royalty." She paused. "But those things are how you treat someone like a person, and I had been a princess so long I had almost forgotten that I was also a person. I think about that often. I think it is the truest thing anyone has said to me, about this entire story, and about what happened and why. Not because it says something special about me. Honestly, I'm a fairly ordinary person who happened to be paying attention at the right time. But because it says something about what people need, whether they are human or Veltheran or any other kind of being that has ever sat alone in a room full of noise and looked toward the window. People need to be seen before they are needed. People need someone who shows up without a performance prepared. People need the small things. That is the whole secret. That is everything. I do not know why it is so rare. I suspect it is rare because most of us are so busy trying to offer the best and largest version of ourselves that we forget the whole point is just to be present for someone else. I was present, I had no reason to be. She chose me for it. And every morning, on this moon orbiting a planet I am still not entirely used to, I wake up before the schedule begins and I go to the East Garden and I sit on the low wall with my feet hanging over the edge. Sometimes she is already there. Sometimes she arrives a few minutes later. Sometimes we talk and sometimes we just sit and look at the fog. We always have bread. The planet turns above us, unhurried and enormous, the storm system that has been there longer than either of our civilizations moving in its slow and certain spiral. The light comes through at the angle that the Velthara call the waking light, which is the light before the day officially begins, and it is silver and soft and exactly ordinary enough to feel like something worth keeping. She chose the silent one. I think she just chose the one who was actually listening. And I think that is the most human thing about this entire story, not the diplomacy, not the crisis, not the